The servants found him at dawn, sprawled across the Persian rug in the library, his fingernails black as coal, and his mouth twisted in a final, silent scream. The bitter almond scent of arsenic still lingered in the morning air, mixing with the smell of leather-bound books and old money. But Charles Whitfield wasn't the first man to die this way at Ravenscroft Manor. He was the seventh, and the woman who killed him. She was supposed to become his mother-in-law in 3 days. What you're about to hear isn't just another true crime story from America's gilded past. This is forbidden knowledge that 3 generations of Rhode Island's most powerful families have spent millions to bury. Because what happened in that Newport mansion between 1861 and 1863 reveals a truth so disturbing about the nature of power, manipulation, and family loyalty that it threatens everything you thought you knew about human nature itself. The documents I'm about to share with you were sealed in a courthouse basement for 60 years. When they were finally discovered in 1924, the authorities considered burning them rather than letting the public see what Margaret Aldridge had really done to secure her family's fortune. Tonight, you're going to learn why some secrets are kept buried, why certain truths are considered too dangerous for ordinary people to know, and how one woman's hunger for control created a web of murder, seduction, and betrayal that would make Machiavelli himself recoil in horror. By the time you finish watching this video, you'll understand why real power isn't about money or status. It's about the willingness to do what others cannot even imagine. And you'll never look at wealthy families, respectable society, or even your own capacity for darkness the same way again. This is the story of how a mother destroyed her own daughter to steal everything she loved. Welcome to the A.B.S. Newport, Rhode Island, 1861. While America tears itself apart in civil war, the wealthy elite gather in their marble palaces, playing elaborate games of social chess where human lives are merely pieces to be sacrificed for advantage. This is where our story begins, in a world where morality is a luxury only the poor can afford, and where the right marriage or convenient death can secure a family's dominance for generations. Margaret Aldridge understood this game better than anyone. At 47, she possessed something far more dangerous than beauty or charm. She had the cold intelligence of a predator who had learned that survival requires the complete abandonment of conscience. 3 years earlier, she had murdered her husband Edmund, making it look like a riding accident so perfect that even the family doctor never suspected. The arsenic had done its work slowly, mimicking the symptoms of internal injuries, while Margaret played the grieving widow with such convincing anguish that Newport society donated money for Edmund's memorial. But Margaret's hunger for security wasn't satisfied by one convenient death. She had discovered something intoxicating about the power to end lives, to manipulate fate itself, to be the hidden force that determined who lived and who died in her social circle. When her daughter Eleanor announced her engagement to Charles Whitfield, a handsome young lawyer from Boston with substantial inheritance prospects, Margaret saw an opportunity that excited her in ways she hadn't felt in years. Charles wasn't just Eleanor's fiancé. He was the perfect instrument of destruction, a chess piece she could capture and turn against everyone who threatened her carefully constructed world. What makes Margaret Aldridge truly terrifying isn't that she was a serial killer. It's that she was a serial killer with the social skills of a diplomat, the strategic mind of a general, and the complete moral flexibility that only comes from understanding that other people aren't really human. They're just obstacles to be removed or tools to be used, and Charles Whitfield was about to become both. The seduction began with poisoned brandy and ended with a young man's soul. Margaret had been studying Charles for weeks before making her first move, learning his fears, his desires, his financial anxieties, the way his voice changed when he talked about his doubts. She understood that breaking a man requires more than physical temptation. You have to make him complicit in his own destruction, force him to choose corruption over conscience until he can no longer remember who he used to be. That first night on the terrace, with the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly before them and the scent of Margaret's perfume clouding his judgment, Charles crossed a line he would never be able to uncross. But it wasn't just adultery Margaret was after. She needed something far more binding than sexual betrayal. She needed him to become a murderer. The conversation that followed their physical encounter was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Margaret revealed everything to Charles: Edmund's murder, the forged documents, the careful planning that had made her wealthy and untouchable. But she presented it all as tragic necessity, the desperate acts of a woman protecting her daughters from an abusive husband who planned to leave them penniless. Charles, already drowning in guilt and confusion, found himself nodding along as Margaret explained how sometimes good people are forced to do terrible things to protect the innocent. She made murder sound like an act of love, poison like medicine, manipulation like protection. By dawn, Charles Whitfield was no longer just Eleanor's unfaithful fiancé. He was Margaret's accomplice, bound to her by secrets that would destroy him if revealed, trapped in a web of complicity that made escape impossible. Margaret had chosen her weapon perfectly. Charles's legal training, made him valuable for planning the perfect crimes, while his guilt made him controllable. His love for Eleanor, twisted into something poisonous by his betrayal, would make him the perfect instrument for her destruction, because Margaret had realized something that would shock even the most cynical observers of human nature. The best way to destroy someone isn't to make them your enemy. It's to make them love you enough to help you kill everything they once held sacred. Eleanor Aldridge had no idea that her engagement party would be her death warrant, but Margaret knew exactly how to turn celebration into execution. The guest list read like a registry of New England's most powerful families: the Vanderbilts, the Astors, Newport's social elite gathering to witness what they believed would be a perfect union between two respected bloodlines. What they were actually witnessing was a carefully orchestrated psychological warfare operation designed to identify and eliminate every person who might threaten Margaret's secrets. Margaret moved through the party like a spider cataloguing flies, her steel-grey eyes noting every conversation, every connection, every potential source of danger. When Dr. Hensley mentioned his concerns about Edmund's death to Judge Morrison, Margaret filed it away as a problem requiring immediate attention. When Eleanor's cousin from Boston asked pointed questions about Thomas Richardson's convenient carriage accident, Margaret smiled graciously while mentally adding another name to her list. The party was a revelation of just how precarious Margaret's position really was. Too many people were asking too many questions, connecting too many dots. Eleanor herself had become dangerously curious, corresponding with Richardson's sister about the circumstances of his death, researching family financial records with the naive belief that truth would somehow set her free. Margaret realized that her daughter's investigation wasn't just threatening her security, it was threatening Charles's future as well, since his association with a family of murderers would destroy his legal career and social standing permanently. This gave Margaret the perfect psychological lever to ensure Charles's continued cooperation. She wasn't asking him to kill Eleanor out of greed or jealousy. She was asking him to save both their futures from a naive young woman whose dangerous curiosity would destroy them all if left unchecked. The beauty of Margaret's logic was that it contained just enough truth to make the lies believable. Eleanor was investigating, she was asking dangerous questions, and she was naive about the consequences of exposing family secrets. Margaret simply omitted the crucial detail that Eleanor was investigating because she suspected her fiancé and mother of murder, not because she was maliciously trying to destroy anyone. By the end of the engagement party, Margaret had identified 7 people who posed immediate threats to her security. Within 6 months, all 7 would be dead, their deaths so perfectly orchestrated that Newport society would speak of the tragic string of accidents that seemed to follow the Aldridge family like a curse. The first murder after Charles became Margaret's accomplice wasn't Eleanor. It was Dr. Hensley, the family physician whose suspicions about Edmund's death had made him too dangerous to live. Margaret understood that killing Eleanor immediately would create obvious connections, but eliminating the doctor would remove the primary source of medical expertise that could expose her poisoning methods. Dr. Hensley's death was a masterpiece of misdirection. Margaret invited him to dinner ostensibly to discuss Eleanor's pre-wedding health examination, a perfectly reasonable request that gave her legitimate access to his food and drink. She had Charles engage the doctor in lengthy conversations about legal aspects of medical practice, establishing himself as a witness to Hensley's apparent good health and normal behavior throughout the evening. The poison Margaret used wasn't arsenic this time. She had learned from studying Edmund's death that varying her methods would make pattern recognition more difficult. Instead, she employed a slower-acting toxin derived from foxglove plants growing in her own garden, a substance that would cause heart failure several hours after consumption, mimicking natural cardiac arrest in a 62-year-old man with a history of chest pains. Dr. Hensley collapsed at his home the following morning while preparing for his hospital rounds. The attending physician who examined the body found nothing suspicious. An elderly doctor dying of apparent heart failure was hardly unusual in 1861. Charles watched Margaret's calm efficiency throughout the planning and execution with fascination and horror. She had discussed murder with the same methodical attention to detail that another woman might use for planning a dinner party, considering variables, anticipating complications, preparing contingencies with the thoroughness of a military strategist. What terrified Charles most wasn't Margaret's cruelty, but her complete lack of emotional reaction to ending a human life. She felt no more guilt about poisoning Dr. Hensley than she would about swatting a fly, because she had mentally reclassified other people as obstacles rather than fellow human beings. This psychological transformation is what separates true psychopaths from ordinary criminals. Margaret didn't kill despite having empathy. She killed because she had systematically destroyed her own capacity for empathy, viewing it as a weakness that prevented optimal decision-making. Charles was beginning to understand that he hadn't just become complicit in murder. He had become the student of a woman who had perfected the art of human elimination. 3 days after Dr. Hensley's funeral, Eleanor found the letters. Hidden in her mother's private desk drawer, wrapped in black silk like funeral shrouds, were correspondence that revealed the true scope of Margaret's activities. Letters from insurance companies confirming policy payouts after Edmund's death. Letters from lawyers discussing estate transfers that had occurred suspiciously close to other family deaths. Most damning of all, letters from Charles himself, written in his own hand, discussing methods and timing for what he euphemistically called resolving family complications. Eleanor's discovery changed everything. She wasn't just a curious daughter investigating family history anymore. She was a witness to ongoing criminal conspiracy, armed with physical evidence that could destroy both Margaret and Charles if presented to the authorities. Her first instinct was denial, the desperate hope that the letters meant something innocent, that her rational mind was misinterpreting perfectly legitimate communications. But Charles's handwriting was unmistakable, and his legal terminology was precise enough to leave no doubt about his involvement in planning what could only be murders. The psychological impact of this discovery on Eleanor was devastating beyond mere betrayal. She realized that the man she loved, the man she had trusted with her future, her body, her heart, had been systematically planning her death while kissing her goodnight and promising eternal devotion. The mother who had raised her, protected her, taught her everything about how to be a woman of quality and grace, had been using that intimate knowledge to plan the perfect method of killing her. Eleanor's world didn't just collapse. It inverted, revealing that everything she had believed about love, family, trust, and human nature was an elaborate lie designed to make her easier to murder. For someone raised in the sheltered environment of Newport High, GH society. This revelation was psychologically shattering in ways that would make strong men break down completely. But Eleanor Aldridge possessed something neither Margaret nor Charles had anticipated: her father's steel core beneath her gentle exterior, and an intelligence sharp enough to understand that her survival now depended entirely on her ability to outmaneuver two people who had been planning her death for weeks. The game was about to change, because Eleanor had just transformed from victim to player. Eleanor's response to discovering the conspiracy against her life revealed something that Margaret had catastrophically underestimated about her own daughter. Instead of panicking, confronting her killers, or fleeing to the authorities, Eleanor made a decision that demonstrated she had inherited more of Margaret's strategic intelligence than anyone realized. She would pretend she knew nothing while systematically gathering evidence to destroy both her mother and fiancé. But Eleanor's plan went beyond mere self-preservation. She had realized something that filled her with cold fury. If Margaret and Charles were planning to kill her, they had almost certainly killed others. Her father Edmund, her former suitor Thomas Richardson, possibly others whose deaths had been dismissed as tragic accidents. Eleanor wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She was seeking justice for murder victims whose killers had been walking free, celebrated by society, trusted and respected while carrying the blood of innocents on their hands. The psychological transformation in Eleanor was remarkable. Within hours of discovering the letters, she had shed her naive trust in human goodness and developed the calculating mindset necessary for survival in a world where the people closest to her were predators. She began documenting Margaret's daily routines, noting when and where her mother had access to food and drink consumed by potential victims. She started researching the medical symptoms of various poisons, using her access to Edmund's medical library to understand how different toxins might be administered and detected. Most importantly, she began playing the role of unsuspecting victim with such convincing authenticity that even Margaret's trained eye couldn't detect the deception. Eleanor continued planning her wedding with apparent enthusiasm, discussing dress fittings and flower arrangements, while mentally cataloguing every opportunity Margaret and Charles had to poison her. She maintained her affectionate behavior toward Charles, accepting his kisses and endearments, while studying his face for signs of guilt or anticipation. The psychological strain of this performance would have broken most people, but Eleanor discovered she possessed reserves of strength she had never accessed before. Terror, it turned out, was an excellent teacher of skills she had never needed in her sheltered life. Skills like deception, manipulation, strategic thinking, and the ability to smile lovingly at someone while planning their destruction. Eleanor was becoming someone Margaret would recognize and respect, a worthy opponent capable of playing the game of life and death with the same ruthless intelligence that had made Margaret so successful. Margaret's first mistake was underestimating her daughter's intelligence. Her second mistake was overestimating Charles's reliability under pressure. As Eleanor's wedding day approached and the plan to eliminate her reached its final stages, Charles began showing signs of psychological breakdown that threatened to expose everything Margaret had worked to build. The guilt of planning to murder the woman he had genuinely loved was eating away at Charles's sanity like acid. He had trouble sleeping, lost weight dramatically, and developed a nervous tremor that made Margaret worry he would arouse suspicion at exactly the wrong moment. During their private meetings, Charles would sometimes break down completely, weeping like a child, and begging Margaret to find another solution that didn't require Eleanor's death. Margaret's response to Charles's weakness revealed the full extent of her psychological evolution. She felt no sympathy for his suffering, only irritation at his lack of professional composure. In her mind, Charles had accepted the benefits of their partnership, her body, her money, her protection from the consequences of Edmund's murder, and was now obligated to fulfill his part of their agreement, regardless of his personal feelings. When Charles suggested they could simply flee Newport together and start new lives elsewhere, Margaret's reaction was swift and terrifying. She reminded him that he was now legally complicit in Dr. Hensley's murder, with physical evidence linking him to the crime. She had made sure of that by having him handle the poison container and forge the doctor's signature on a false medical report. Charles wasn't just her lover or business partner anymore. He was her prisoner, bound by chains of mutual guilt that made betrayal impossible without destroying himself. But Margaret had miscalculated the psychological pressure she was applying. Instead of strengthening Charles's resolve, her threats were pushing him toward a complete mental collapse that could expose them both. A man with nothing left to lose becomes capable of actions that rational criminals would never risk, and Charles was rapidly approaching that dangerous state of mind. Eleanor, meanwhile, had been monitoring Charles's deterioration with the cold assessment of a predator studying wounded prey. She realized that his guilt and fear made him the weak link in the conspiracy, the point where pressure could be applied to bring down the entire structure Margaret had built. The question was whether Eleanor could exploit Charles's weakness before Margaret decided he had become too dangerous to live. Because Margaret Aldridge had never hesitated to eliminate partners who threatened her security, and Charles's obvious psychological distress was making him a liability she might choose to remove permanently. The night before Eleanor's wedding, Margaret made her final preparations for murder with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. She had chosen the wedding reception itself as the perfect moment for Eleanor's death, a crowded event with multiple opportunities for poisoning, hundreds of potential suspects, and the kind of tragic irony that would make investigators assume the death was either accidental or the work of an outside enemy rather than family members. Margaret's plan was elegantly simple and absolutely brilliant. Eleanor would collapse during her wedding dance, apparently overcome by excitement and the stress of the day. By the time a doctor could be summoned, she would be dead from what appeared to be heart failure, brought on by an undiagnosed weak heart, a condition that claimed young women with tragic regularity in 1861. The poison Margaret had selected was a refined extract from lily-of-the-valley flowers, a substance that would cause cardiac arrest while leaving minimal trace evidence in the body. She had been cultivating the plant specifically for this purpose, extracting and concentrating the toxin over several weeks to ensure maximum potency. The delivery method would be Eleanor's champagne glass during the traditional toast, with Margaret herself providing the fatal drink as a touching gesture of maternal love. Charles's role was to ensure that Eleanor consumed the entire glass by engaging her in an emotional conversation about their future together, making her too distracted to notice any unusual taste while ensuring she ingested a lethal dose. It was a plan that demonstrated Margaret's complete understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and criminal methodology. But Margaret had made one crucial error in her calculations. She assumed that Eleanor would remain the naive, trusting daughter she had always been, never suspecting that her own careful tutelage in observation and strategic thinking had created an opponent capable of matching her move for move. Eleanor had spent the previous week analyzing every aspect of Margaret's behavior, and she had identified the wedding reception as the most likely moment for the murder attempt. More importantly, she had devised a counter-strategy that would turn Margaret's own plan against her, transforming the wedding from Eleanor's execution into Margaret's exposure. The student was about to surpass the teacher in the most deadly game either of them had ever played. Eleanor's wedding day dawned with crystalline perfection, clear skies, gentle ocean breezes, and the kind of golden sunlight that makes Newport's marble mansions gleam like temples to wealth and privilege. But beneath the surface beauty, three people were preparing for a battle that would determine who lived, who died, and who would control the Aldridge fortune when the sun set. Margaret moved through the morning preparations with calm efficiency, personally overseeing every detail while mentally rehearsing the sequence of actions that would eliminate Eleanor by evening. She had sewn a small vial of lily-of-the-valley extract into the lining of her dress, positioned for easy access during the champagne toast. Her behavior toward Eleanor was perfectly maternal, helping with her dress, arranging her hair, offering gentle advice about married life, while calculating exactly how long the poison would take to work and how she would react when her daughter collapsed. Charles spent the morning in his assigned room at the mansion, supposedly preparing for the ceremony, but actually fighting a losing battle against complete psychological breakdown. His hands shook so violently he couldn't tie his cravat properly, and his face had taken on the greyish pallor of a man walking toward his own execution. When the other groomsmen arrived to escort him to the ceremony, they commented on his obvious nervousness, attributing it to normal wedding day jitters, without realizing they were witnessing a man preparing to commit the most heinous betrayal imaginable. Eleanor, meanwhile, had transformed herself into something Margaret would never recognize, a cold-blooded strategist preparing to destroy her own mother. She had spent hours practicing the facial expressions and body language of a happy bride, ensuring that her performance would be flawless, even while her mind focused entirely on survival. Hidden in her wedding dress, sewn into the same kind of secret pocket Margaret had created, Eleanor carried her own insurance policy, a vial of ipecac syrup that would induce immediate vomiting if she accidentally consumed any poison, and copies of the incriminating letters that would expose Margaret and Charles if Eleanor died under suspicious circumstances. But Eleanor's real weapon wasn't chemical or documentary, it was psychological. She had realized that Margaret's greatest weakness was her assumption that other people were inferior in intelligence and ruthlessness. Margaret had never considered the possibility that her gentle daughter might be capable of outmaneuvering her, and that blind spot was about to prove fatal. The wedding ceremony itself proceeded flawlessly, with Eleanor playing her role as radiant bride, while Charles struggled through his vows with obvious distress that the guests attributed to overwhelming emotion rather than overwhelming guilt. The wedding reception at Ravenscroft Manor was a display of wealth and power that would have impressed European royalty, but for the three principal actors, it was simply an elaborate stage for the final act of their deadly drama. Margaret had positioned herself perfectly for the champagne toast, standing close enough to Eleanor to ensure she could deliver the poison-Ned glass while maintaining the appearance of maternal devotion. The other guests, Newport's most prominent families, chatted and laughed, completely unaware they were witnessing what Margaret intended to be a masterfully executed public murder. When the moment came for the traditional toast to the bride and groom, Margaret moved with practiced grace, personally selecting Eleanor's champagne glass and adding the lily-of-the-valley extract with a motion so subtle that even trained observers would have missed it. She approached Eleanor with tears of apparent joy glistening in her steel-grey eyes, preparing to deliver what she believed would be her daughter's final drink. But Eleanor had been watching Margaret's every movement with predatory intensity, and she recognized the moment of poisoning, despite Margaret's skill at concealment. Instead of accepting the glass immediately, Eleanor created a distraction by calling for the musicians to play a special song that Edmund had loved, buying herself precious seconds to implement her own plan. While the guests' attention focused on the orchestra, Eleanor executed a switch that demonstrated she had learned Margaret's lessons in misdirection perfectly. Using sleight of hand that would have impressed a professional magician, she exchanged her poison champagne with Charles's glass, ensuring that the lily-of-the-valley extract intended for her would instead be consumed by her treacherous fiancé. The psychological impact on Charles when he realized what had happened was immediate and devastating. As Margaret raised her own glass for the toast and Charles lifted his to his lips, Eleanor made eye contact with him and smiled with an expression of such cold triumph that he understood instantly that his victim had become his executioner. Charles tried to lower the glass, but Eleanor's voice rang out across the reception hall. "To my beloved Charles, who has taught me so much about the true nature of love and loyalty, may he receive everything he deserves." The social pressure to complete the toast in front of Newport's elite made it impossible for Charles to refuse the drink without creating a scandal, and Margaret's own champagne glass was already at her lips before she could intervene. Charles consumed the poison intended for Eleanor, while Margaret watched in horror, realizing that her perfect plan had been turned against her with devastating precision. Charles Whitfield died exactly as Margaret had planned Eleanor would die, collapsing during the wedding dance, with symptoms that appeared to be sudden heart failure brought on by excitement and stress. But instead of grief and shock, Eleanor displayed a composure that chilled Margaret to her core. While the other wedding guests panicked and called for doctors, Eleanor knelt beside Charles's convulsing body and whispered words that only Margaret was close enough to hear. "Did you really think I wouldn't discover your letters? Did you imagine I was too stupid to protect myself from my own mother and fiancé?" Margaret's world shattered in that moment as she realized the full scope of her miscalculation. Eleanor hadn't just survived Margaret's murder attempt, she had turned it into a weapon against her conspirators with surgical precision. More terrifying still, Eleanor's whispered words revealed that she knew everything about the conspiracy, had known for days, and had been playing her own game while Margaret believed she was controlling the situation. The official investigation into Charles's death was perfunctory, exactly as Margaret had planned for Eleanor's murder. A young man dying of apparent heart failure during an emotional event wasn't suspicious enough to warrant extensive inquiry, especially when his bride was so obviously devastated by the tragedy. Eleanor's performance as the grieving widow was flawless, displaying just the right combination of shock, sorrow, and brave determination to continue living that convinced everyone of her innocence. But privately, Eleanor had become something that terrified Margaret more than any external threat ever could. A worthy opponent who understood exactly how the game was played and possessed the ruthlessness necessary to win. That night, as the last wedding guests departed and Ravenscroft Manor fell silent, Eleanor confronted Margaret in the library, where Charles's body had first been discovered. The conversation that followed would determine whether Margaret would face justice for her crimes, or whether Eleanor would choose to become the same kind of monster her mother had created. Standing over the Persian rug still stained with Charles's blood, Eleanor presented Margaret with a choice that demonstrated she had learned her mother's lessons about power and control perfectly. Margaret could confess to Edmund's murder and Dr. Hensley's death, face trial and probable execution, and allow Eleanor to inherit the family fortune with a clean conscience. Or she could refuse to confess and face the consequences of having created an enemy who now possessed all of Margaret's skills, plus the moral justification to use them without restraint. The student had not just surpassed the teacher. She had become something far more dangerous, a killer with a conscience who could rationalize any action as justice for past crimes. Margaret's response to Eleanor's ultimatum revealed the true depths of her psychological evolution and the complete absence of any human feeling that might have once made her redeemable. Instead of showing remorse, fear, or even respect for Eleanor's tactical brilliance, Margaret laughed, a sound so cold and empty that it seemed to drain warmth from the library itself. She had realized something that filled her with a perverse pride rather than horror. She had successfully transformed her own daughter into a killer. Eleanor's murder of Charles wasn't a victory of good over evil. It was proof that Margaret's teachings had taken root so deeply that Eleanor was now capable of the same calculated cruelty that Margaret had perfected over years of practice. "You think you've won something," Margaret said, studying Eleanor's face with scientific interest. "But look at yourself, my dear daughter. Look at what you've become. You murdered a man tonight with the same cold precision I used on your father. You manipulated a social situation to commit the perfect crime. You felt no guilt watching Charles die, only satisfaction at your successful revenge. You are me, Eleanor. You are everything I trained you to be." The psychological impact of this observation on Eleanor was devastating because it contained undeniable truth. She had killed Charles not in self-defense or heat of passion, but through calculated planning and manipulation that demonstrated she possessed every trait that made Margaret a successful psychopath. The realization that she might be fundamentally the same as her mother threatened to destroy Eleanor's sense of moral superiority and justify her actions. But Margaret had made a crucial error in revealing her pride in Eleanor's transformation. She had exposed her deepest vulnerability, the narcissistic belief that creating another killer like herself represented some kind of achievement, rather than a horror to be prevented at any cost. Eleanor's response showed that she understood this weakness and was prepared to exploit it ruthlessly. "You're right," Eleanor said with a smile that matched Margaret's for coldness. "I am exactly what you trained me to be. Which means I understand better than anyone else exactly how dangerous you are and exactly what needs to be done to stop you permanently." Margaret had created her own perfect executioner, someone who possessed all her skills but none of her emotional limitations, someone who could kill without guilt because she genuinely believed she was serving justice rather than merely satisfying personal desires. The hunter had become the hunted, and the predator was about to discover what it felt like to be prey to something even more ruthless than herself. Eleanor had learned the ultimate lesson Margaret had never intended to teach. How to eliminate someone who understands your methods better than you understand theirs. Comment: blood remembers blood twice if you understand what Eleanor discovered about the true nature of family loyalty, and if you're ready to learn what happens when victims become predators. Comment: blood remembers blood twice if you've realized that the most dangerous enemy isn't a stranger who hates you. It's someone who loves you enough to learn exactly how to destroy you. Eleanor's education in murder had been conducted by the finest teacher imaginable, and Margaret was about to discover that her student had surpassed every lesson. The confrontation between Margaret and Eleanor that night transformed Ravenscroft Manor from a home into a battlefield where two master manipulators would test their skills against each other with lethal stakes. Eleanor had advantages Margaret lacked: moral justification for her actions, evidence of Margaret's crimes, and the element of surprise that came from being consistently underestimated. But Margaret possessed experience, resources, and the crucial understanding that Eleanor still retained enough conscience to be manipulated through guilt and emotional attachment. Margaret's opening gambit was to attack Eleanor's newfound confidence by forcing her to confront the psychological cost of becoming a killer. She described in vivid detail how Charles had suffered during his final moments, how his trust in Eleanor had made his betrayal even more agonizing, how his love had been transformed into a weapon used to destroy him. She painted Eleanor's actions as the ultimate corruption of everything pure and innocent about her character, suggesting that killing Charles had damned Eleanor's soul just as thoroughly as Margaret's own. Crimes had damned hers, but Eleanor had anticipated this psychological assault and prepared a devastating counterattack. She revealed that she had spent the previous week not just planning Charles's death, but investigating the full scope of Margaret's activities over the past decade. Eleanor had discovered evidence of murders Margaret had never confessed to. Servants who had died after learning too much, business partners who had suffered convenient accidents after becoming liabilities, even Catherine's former suitor, who had died in a suspicious drowning accident 2 years earlier. Eleanor had documented everything, creating a comprehensive record of Margaret's crimes that transformed her from a woman who had killed 3 people into a serial killer responsible for at least 8 deaths over 10 years. The revelation that Eleanor knew about Catherine's former suitor was particularly devastating for Margaret, because it proved that Eleanor understood something Margaret had hoped to keep hidden, that she was prepared to kill her own daughters if they threatened her security. Eleanor wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She was fighting to protect Catherine from a mother who viewed her children as expendable assets rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. The game had evolved beyond personal survival into something resembling a war for the soul of the Aldridge family, with Eleanor representing the last hope for preserving some remnant of human decency in a bloodline that Margaret had systematically corrupted through murder and manipulation. Eleanor's investigation had uncovered something that would have terrified even hardened law enforcement officials. Margaret hadn't just been killing people who threatened her security. She had been experimenting with different methods, studying the effectiveness of various poisons, testing delivery systems, and refining her techniques with the systematic approach of a scientist conducting research. Hidden in Margaret's private study, Eleanor had found detailed journals documenting each murder, complete with observations about victim behavior, poison effectiveness, and lessons learned for future applications. Margaret had been keeping score, treating human lives like laboratory specimens in her personal study of death. The journals revealed that Margaret viewed murder not as a necessary evil, but as an art form she was determined to master. She had studied the great poisoners of history, Lucrezia Borgia, Catherine de' Medici, Mary Ann Cotton, and had set herself the goal of surpassing their achievements through superior planning and more sophisticated methods. Each death had been carefully analyzed for what it could teach her about improving her techniques, with particular attention to creating symptoms that would be misinterpreted by physicians and overlooked by investigators. But the most horrifying discovery in Margaret's journals was her long-term plan for the Aldridge family. She had been systematically eliminating anyone who could challenge her control, while positioning herself to inherit multiple fortunes through carefully orchestrated deaths. Catherine was next on her list, followed by Eleanor's children when she eventually had them, creating a pattern that would make Margaret the sole beneficiary of wealth accumulated across several family lines. Margaret wasn't just a serial killer. She was conducting a multi-generational campaign of genocide against her own family, planning to be the last surviving member who could claim the accumulated wealth of everyone she had murdered. Eleanor's confrontation with this evidence had transformed her understanding of what she was fighting. This wasn't about preventing her own death anymore. It was about stopping a woman with a plan to methodically exterminate everyone she had ever claimed to love in service of a greed so profound it bordered on insanity. The realization that Margaret viewed her own daughters as future murder victims rather than beloved children had completed Eleanor's psychological transformation from victim to executioner. She now understood that showing mercy to Margaret wouldn't just be foolish, it would be morally criminal, allowing a predator to continue hunting innocent family members who had no idea they were being stalked by their own mother. Margaret had created something she never intended, a killer with a conscience who possessed complete moral justification for eliminating the threat she represented. The final game between Margaret and Eleanor began when Eleanor presented her mother with evidence that she had been planning Catherine's murder for over a year. Hidden among Margaret's papers, Eleanor had found detailed observations of Catherine's daily routines, her favorite foods, her friendships, her romantic interests, and most chillingly, notes about which poison would be most suitable for someone of Catherine's age and health. Margaret's plan for Catherine was even more elaborate than her scheme for Eleanor. She intended to use Catherine's upcoming engagement to a wealthy young man from Philadelphia as the perfect cover for murder, staging Catherine's death as a tragic accident during the engagement party that would eliminate her while simultaneously creating a grieving mother narrative that would generate sympathy and deflect suspicion. But Eleanor had discovered something else in Margaret's journals that revealed the true scope of her mother's psychological pathology. Margaret had been poisoning Catherine slowly for months, administering sub-lethal doses of arsenic that would gradually weaken her health and make a sudden death seem more plausible. Catherine's recent complaints of fatigue, digestive problems, and frequent headaches weren't the result of social stress, as Garrett had claimed. They were symptoms of chronic poisoning designed to prepare her body for the final fatal dose. The realization that Margaret had already begun murdering Catherine filled Eleanor with a rage so pure and focused that it burned away any remaining traces of filial affection or moral hesitation. Margaret hadn't just been planning to kill her daughters, she had been torturing Catherine for months, slowly destroying her health while playing the concerned mother, using her intimate knowledge of Catherine's trust to make her complicit in her own murder. Eleanor's response to this discovery demonstrated that she had learned Margaret's most important lesson perfectly. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent people is to eliminate the threat completely and permanently. She made Margaret a final offer that contained no room for negotiation, compromise, or mercy. Margaret would consume a lethal dose of her own arsenic within the hour, dying the same way she had killed Edmund and planning to kill Catherine, or Eleanor would expose everything to the authorities, while ensuring that Margaret's remaining years would be spent in the kind of prison where wealthy women who murdered children were treated with particular brutality by fellow inmates. Margaret's choice wasn't between life and death. It was between a quick death or a slow, agonizing destruction of everything she had worked to build, followed by an execution that would be preceded by years of suffering in conditions that would make death seem like mercy. Eleanor had given her mother exactly the same consideration Margaret had shown her victims, none whatsoever. Margaret's final moments revealed something that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Even facing death, Margaret felt no remorse for her crimes, no love for her daughters, no regret for the lives she had destroyed. Her only emotion was a twisted pride in having created a successor capable of matching her ruthlessness. As she lifted the glass of poisoned wine Eleanor had prepared, Margaret smiled with genuine warmth for the first time Eleanor could remember. "You've learned well, my dear daughter," Margaret said, her steel-grey eyes reflecting something that might have been maternal affection if it hadn't been so completely devoid of human feeling. I always wondered which of my girls would inherit my true nature. I'm proud that it was you, Eleanor. You have the strength to do what needs to be done, the intelligence to plan properly, and most importantly, the ability to justify anything in service of a greater purpose. You'll make an excellent head of this family. Eleanor watched her mother die with the same clinical detachment Margaret had shown while planning the deaths of others. The arsenic worked quickly, causing convulsions that Margaret endured with remarkable stoicism, as if she were conducting one final experiment on the effectiveness of her preferred poison. Her last words were a whisper meant only for Eleanor's ears. The journals. Everything I learned. It's all yours now. Use it wisely. Margaret Aldridge died as she had lived, calculating, manipulative, and completely convinced that her crimes were justified by their success. But her death didn't end the horror she had created. It merely transferred ownership of that horror to Eleanor, who now possessed not just the means and knowledge to continue Margaret's work, but the moral framework to justify doing so in the name of family protection. Eleanor's first decision as the new head of the Aldridge family was to destroy Margaret's journals and evidence of her crimes, not to protect Margaret's reputation, but to prevent anyone from learning techniques that could be used to harm other innocent people. Her second decision was to ensure that Catherine would never learn the truth about how close she had come to death or how their mother had been slowly poisoning her for months. Some knowledge, Eleanor realized, was too dangerous and too painful for decent people to carry. But Eleanor's third decision revealed that Margaret's lessons had taken root more deeply than she wanted to admit. She began planning how to eliminate the remaining threats to Catherine's safety. The insurance investigators who were still asking questions about Edmund's death, the relatives who had been corresponding with Eleanor about family history, the servants who might have observed suspicious behavior over the years. Eleanor told herself she was protecting Catherine and preserving the family's reputation, but the methods she contemplated were indistinguishable from Margaret's own approach to problem-solving. 3 months after Margaret's death, Catherine Aldridge noticed that her sister Eleanor had changed in subtle but disturbing ways. Eleanor's grief for their mother seemed perfunctory, lasting exactly as long as social convention required before being replaced by a business-like efficiency that impressed and unsettled Newport society. Eleanor took control of the family finances with an expertise that seemed to come from nowhere, making investment decisions that increased their wealth substantially while cutting ties with business partners and family friends who had been close to Margaret. Most troubling, Eleanor had begun asking Catherine detailed questions about her daily routines, her health, her romantic interests, and her future plans. Questions that felt more like an interrogation than sisterly concern. Catherine, still recovering from months of mysterious illness that had cleared up dramatically after Margaret's death, didn't understand why Eleanor seemed so intensely interested in controlling every aspect of her life. When Catherine mentioned her desire to travel to Europe and perhaps live abroad permanently, Eleanor's reaction was swift and decisive. Absolutely not. The family needed to remain together, Eleanor explained, to protect each other and preserve their reputation during this difficult time. Catherine accepted this reasoning, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was watching her with the same calculating intensity she remembered in their mother's steel-grey eyes. Eleanor's transformation wasn't entirely voluntary. She had discovered that inheriting Margaret's knowledge came with inheriting Margaret's paranoia, the constant awareness of threats that might require elimination, the exhausting mental burden of maintaining lies and covering up crimes. Every conversation with investigators, every social interaction with people who had known Margaret, every business dealing that involved family history required careful management to prevent exposure of secrets that could destroy them both. But more disturbing was Eleanor's realization that she was beginning to enjoy the power that came with being the only person who knew the complete truth about the Aldridge family. She liked being the one who made decisions, who controlled information, who determined what Catherine would be allowed to know about her own life. The psychological satisfaction of wielding that kind of absolute authority over another human being was intoxicating in ways Eleanor hadn't expected, and she was beginning to understand why Margaret had been so reluctant to share control with anyone, even her own daughters. When Catherine's mysterious illness returned briefly, just a day of nausea and fatigue that Eleanor attributed to stress, Eleanor found herself studying Catherine's symptoms with clinical interest rather than sisterly concern. The thought crossed her mind that Catherine might be happier if she didn't have to worry about complex family business matters, if Eleanor simply handled everything, and Catherine could live the carefree life of a protected younger sister without burdensome responsibilities. It would be simple to arrange, Eleanor realized, a gentle, gradual approach that would preserve Catherine's happiness while ensuring she never became a threat to family security. Eleanor's first test of her newfound power came when Judge Morrison contacted her about irregularities he had discovered in Edmund's estate documents. The judge had been reviewing old cases and noticed discrepancies in timing and witness signatures that suggested possible forgery related to Edmund's will and insurance policies. It was exactly the kind of investigation Margaret had feared, and Eleanor realized she was facing her first decision about whether to solve problems through manipulation or elimination. Eleanor's handling of Judge Morrison demonstrated that she had absorbed Margaret's lessons about the psychological aspects of murder. Instead of rushing to poison him, she spent weeks studying his weaknesses, his family situation, his financial pressures, and his personal vulnerabilities. She discovered that Morrison was in debt due to his son's gambling problems and his wife's expensive medical treatment for a chronic illness. Eleanor's solution was elegant. She offered Morrison a substantial loan to cover his family's expenses, presented as compassionate assistance from a family friend during difficult times. The loan came with informal conditions that required Morrison to avoid pursuing investigations that might harm the Aldridge family's reputation, not because Eleanor was asking him to suppress evidence, but because she was sure he would understand that some historical matters were better left undisturbed. Morrison accepted the loan gratefully, and his investigation into Edmund's estate quietly disappeared from his active case files. Eleanor had successfully neutralized a threat through financial manipulation rather than murder, demonstrating that she possessed strategic options Margaret had never developed. But the psychological impact of corrupting Judge Morrison was profound for Eleanor because it showed her how easy it was to make good people complicit in covering up crimes through carefully applied pressure and incentives. Morrison wasn't evil, but his family's needs made him willing to look the other way when presented with sufficient motivation. Eleanor began to understand that most people could be controlled through manipulation of their circumstances rather than elimination, which was both more efficient and more satisfying than murder. The power to corrupt others, to make them choose personal benefit over moral principles, gave Eleanor a sense of superiority that was even more intoxicating than the power to end lives. She was beginning to see why Margaret had enjoyed her game so much, not just because they eliminated threats, but because they proved that other people were fundamentally weak and selfish beneath their veneer of respectability. Eleanor was discovering that she could be more effective than Margaret had ever been because she understood something Margaret had missed. The most complete victory isn't killing your enemies, it's making them into willing servants who destroy themselves to serve your interests. Catherine's engagement to William Hartwell, announced 6 months after Margaret's death, should have been a cause for celebration. Instead, it became the catalyst for Eleanor's complete transformation into something indistinguishable from the monster Margaret had been. William was everything a respectable suitor should be: wealthy, well-educated, from an excellent family, and genuinely devoted to Catherine. But Eleanor saw something in William's devotion that filled her with familiar cold rage. He was giving Catherine someone to love more than her family, someone who might eventually take Catherine away from Eleanor's control and protection. Eleanor's investigation of William revealed no obvious threats to family security, but it did uncover something that Margaret would have recognized as extremely dangerous. William was encouraging Catherine to be independent, to think for herself, to question family traditions that didn't make sense to her modern sensibilities. During their courtship, Catherine had begun asking Eleanor pointed questions about family finances, about Margaret's sudden death, about why so many people connected to their family had died in accidents over the years. William's influence was making Catherine curious about precisely the subjects Eleanor needed her to ignore, and curiosity had proven fatal for too many people in the Aldridge family's history. Eleanor's first attempt to separate Catherine from William was subtle, creating social situations where William appeared at disadvantage, encouraging Catherine to notice his minor flaws, suggesting that perhaps Catherine was too young for such a serious commitment. But Catherine's happiness with William was genuine and deep, making her resistant to Eleanor's manipulation in ways she had never been before. Love, Eleanor discovered, was a powerful antidote to the kind of psychological control she was trying to maintain. Eleanor's next approach was more direct. She hired private investigators to research William's background, looking for scandals, financial problems, or family secrets that could be used to destroy his reputation or make him unsuitable for marriage into the Aldridge family. When that investigation produced nothing useful, Eleanor began creating problems, arranging business difficulties for William's family, spreading subtle rumors about his character, making life increasingly difficult for him in ways that couldn't be traced back to her directly. But William's love for Catherine made him determined to overcome any obstacles Eleanor created, and his persistence was beginning to make Eleanor understand that gentle pressure wouldn't be sufficient to eliminate the threat he represented. Eleanor was facing the same choice Margaret had confronted repeatedly, whether to allow a potential threat to persist or to eliminate it permanently through direct action. The psychological framework Margaret had created made the answer obvious. William's influence on Catherine was making Catherine dangerous to family security, and dangerous people didn't get to survive simply because they were innocent of deliberate wrongdoing. Eleanor's plan for eliminating William Hartwell revealed that she had surpassed Margaret not just in strategic thinking, but in pure creative cruelty. Instead of simply poisoning William, Eleanor decided to destroy him psychologically first, breaking his spirit and his relationship with Catherine before ending his life. She wanted him to understand exactly how powerless he was against the kind of enemy he had never imagined existed, wanted him to experience the complete collapse of everything he believed about human nature and social order before she granted him the mercy of death. Eleanor's campaign against William began with a series of carefully orchestrated social humiliations designed to isolate him from his support network and make him appear unstable to Catherine's eyes. She arranged for William to be accused of cheating at cards during a gentleman's club gathering, ensuring that the accusation came from sources too respectable to be dismissed, but too circumstantial to be definitively proven. She had false rumors spread about William's family's finances, suggesting that his wealth was built on questionable business practices that could bring scandal to any family associated with him. Most devastatingly, she arranged for evidence to be planted suggesting that William was maintaining inappropriate relationships with married women in Boston, threatening his reputation as a man of honor and his suitability as Catherine's husband. Each attack was carefully calibrated to erode William's standing without creating obvious connections to Eleanor herself. To Catherine and Newport society, William appeared to be the victim of extraordinary bad luck and unfortunate associations rather than deliberate sabotage. But William himself began to recognize that the series of disasters afflicting his life was too systematic to be coincidental, and his growing paranoia about being deliberately targeted made him appear even more unstable to people who didn't understand what he was fighting. Eleanor watched William's psychological deterioration with the same clinical interest Margaret had shown while studying her poison victim's symptoms. She documented his responses to different types of pressure, noted which tactics were most effective at breaking down his confidence, and refined her methods based on his reactions. She was conducting her own experimental research, using William as a test subject for techniques she might need to apply to future threats to family security. But Eleanor had made the same mistake Margaret had made with her. She had underestimated her opponent's capacity for learning and adaptation. William's legal training and business experience had taught him to recognize patterns and investigate systematic problems, skills that made him uniquely qualified to understand that he was being deliberately destroyed by someone with substantial resources and sophisticated planning capabilities. Instead of breaking under Eleanor's pressure, William began conducting his own investigation into the Aldridge family's history, and what he discovered would transform Eleanor's campaign against him into a war that could destroy them both. William Hartwell's investigation into the Aldridge family's history uncovered evidence that Eleanor thought she had destroyed completely. Hidden in the Newport Historical Society's archives, William found newspaper articles, court records, and correspondence that documented a pattern of suspicious deaths surrounding the Aldridge family that stretched back over 20 years. More damaging still, William's legal contacts in Boston had access to insurance company records that showed the unusual number of policy payouts the Aldridge family had received over the years, creating a financial trail that made coincidence impossible to maintain as an explanation. William's most devastating discovery was a letter Thomas Richardson had written to a friend just days before his death, expressing concerns about Edmund Aldridge's suspicious demise and his intention to investigate the circumstances more thoroughly. The letter had never been delivered because Richardson died in his carriage accident before it could be sent, but it had been preserved in his personal effects and eventually donated to a historical archive by his family. Richardson's letter contained specific details about Edmund's symptoms that matched arsenic poisoning perfectly, along with his suspicions about Margaret's behavior during Edmund's final illness. Armed with this evidence, William understood that he wasn't just fighting for his relationship with Catherine. He was fighting for his life against a family of murderers who had been eliminating threats for decades. William's response to this discovery revealed a strength of character that Eleanor had failed to anticipate. Instead of fleeing Newport or attempting to expose the Aldridge family publicly, William decided to protect Catherine by systematically documenting everything he had learned and creating a comprehensive record that would be released automatically if anything happened to him. He arranged for copies of all evidence to be held by multiple lawyers in different cities, with instructions to deliver everything to law enforcement and newspapers if he died under any circumstances that could be considered suspicious. William had created exactly the kind of external threat that Margaret had spent her entire criminal career trying to prevent. Evidence that would survive his death and ensure that killing him would expose the family's crimes rather than eliminating the danger they represented. But William made one crucial error in his planning. He underestimated Eleanor's willingness to sacrifice everything, including Catherine's life and happiness, to prevent exposure of the family's secrets. Eleanor's discovery of William's preparations forced her to confront a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but Catherine's as well. She could allow William to marry Catherine and hope that his love for Catherine would prevent him from ever using his evidence against the family, accepting a lifetime of vulnerability to blackmail and exposure. Or she could eliminate both William and Catherine, destroying the evidence and the witnesses while creating a tragedy so profound that investigators would focus on external threats rather than family members. Eleanor's decision revealed that Margaret's corruption had been complete and irreversible. She chose to view Catherine as an acceptable casualty rather than an innocent sister deserving protection, because Catherine's continued existence alongside William represented an unacceptable risk to Eleanor's security and control. Eleanor's plan for the double murder of Catherine and William was her masterpiece, a scheme so audacious and psychologically sophisticated that it would have earned Margaret's professional admiration. She decided to stage their deaths as a murder-suicide, with William apparently killing Catherine in a fit of jealous rage before taking his own life, driven to madness by the social and financial pressures that had been systematically destroying his life and reputation. The beauty of this plan was that it would eliminate both threats while simultaneously discrediting any evidence William had gathered against the Aldridge family. A man who murdered his fiancée in jealous fury would be seen as mentally unstable, making his accusations against Eleanor's family appear to be the paranoid delusions of a madman rather than legitimate suspicions based on careful research. Eleanor's method for executing this plan demonstrated that she had learned to combine Margaret's technical expertise with her own superior understanding of human psychology. She would poison both William and Catherine during their engagement party, using different substances and timing to create the appearance that William had forced Catherine to drink poison before consuming a lethal dose himself. The physical evidence would support the murder-suicide narrative, while Eleanor played the role of the grieving sister who had lost everything to a madman's violence. But Eleanor's plan required something Margaret had never needed to maintain: the ability to genuinely grieve for Catherine, while simultaneously being responsible for her death. Eleanor convinced herself that she was protecting Catherine from a worse fate, that exposure of the family's crimes would destroy Catherine's reputation and happiness more completely than death itself. In Eleanor's twisted logic, murdering Catherine was an act of love, preventing her sister from suffering the social destruction and legal consequences that would follow if William's evidence ever became public. Eleanor's psychological preparation for Catherine's murder revealed the complete absence of normal human emotion that Margaret had achieved in her own development as a killer. She felt no guilt about planning her sister's death, only a cold satisfaction at solving a complex problem through optimal resource allocation. Catherine had become a liability that threatened Eleanor's security, and liabilities had to be eliminated regardless of personal feelings or social relationships. The engagement party was planned for December 15, 1863, exactly 2 years after Edmund's death and 18 months after Margaret's suicide. Eleanor had chosen the date deliberately, wanting to complete her transformation into the head of the Aldridge family on an anniversary that would remind everyone of the tragic losses that had shaped her character and motivated her fierce protection of family interests. By Christmas 1863, Eleanor Aldridge would be the sole surviving member of her immediate family, inheriting wealth accumulated through multiple murders while being celebrated by Newport society as a brave young woman who had overcome extraordinary personal tragedies with grace and strength. Catherine's final days were spent in complete ignorance of her approaching death, planning her wedding with the innocent happiness of a young woman who had never imagined that her own sister might be her greatest enemy. Eleanor watched Catherine's joy with emotions that would have been incomprehensible to normal human psychology: simultaneous love and cold determination to end the life she was observing. Eleanor genuinely cared about Catherine's happiness, which was why she was determined to ensure Catherine would die before learning truths that would destroy her faith in human goodness. In Eleanor's mind, she was protecting Catherine's innocence by preserving it permanently through death, preventing her sister from experiencing the kind of psychological corruption that had transformed Eleanor herself from a gentle daughter into a calculating killer. The psychological mechanics of Eleanor's self-justification revealed how completely Margaret's teachings had reshaped her moral framework. Eleanor didn't see herself as evil or selfish. She saw herself as the family's protector, making terrible sacrifices to preserve security and reputation for future generations of Aldridges who would never know the price their peace had cost. She had convinced herself that her murders were acts of service rather than crimes, that she was shouldering moral burdens too heavy for weaker people to carry, that her willingness to do unthinkable things made her noble rather than monstrous. Eleanor's preparations for the engagement party murder required her to spend hours each day in Catherine's company, helping with wedding planning while secretly calculating poison dosages and timing logistics. The psychological strain of maintaining loving behavior towards someone you were planning to kill within days would have broken most people, but Eleanor discovered that she possessed reserves of emotional control that impressed even her. She could genuinely enjoy Catherine's happiness about her wedding dress while simultaneously planning how to position Catherine's body to support the murder-suicide narrative. She could laugh at Catherine's jokes while calculating how long the poison would take to work. She could offer sisterly advice about married life while ensuring that Catherine would never live to experience marriage. But Eleanor's most chilling realization during these final days was that part of her was enjoying the anticipation of Catherine's death, not from sadism or cruelty, but from the intellectual satisfaction of executing a perfect crime that would solve all her problems permanently. The thrill of knowing something Catherine didn't know, of controlling Catherine's fate without Catherine's awareness, of being the hidden force that would determine the exact moment Catherine's life ended. These feelings gave Eleanor a sense of power and superiority that was becoming addictive. Margaret had been right about something Eleanor was only now beginning to understand. The psychological rewards of successful murder went far beyond mere problem-solving, creating a sense of godlike authority over life and death that was more intoxicating than any drug or pleasure ordinary people could imagine. William Hartwell's final attempt to save Catherine's life came 3 days before the engagement party, when he made a desperate decision to tell Catherine everything he had discovered about her family's history of murder. The conversation took place in the conservatory at Ravenscroft Manor. Surrounded by the exotic plants Margaret had once used to cultivate her poisons, with Eliane, or secretly listening from an adjoining room where she could monitor every word that passed between them. William's revelation should have saved Catherine's life by giving her the knowledge necessary to protect herself from Eleanor's plan. Instead, it sealed both their fates by confirming Eleanor's assessment that they had become too dangerous to live. Catherine's initial reaction to William's accusations was exactly what Eleanor had predicted: complete disbelief, shock at what seemed like paranoid delusions about her beloved family, and hurt that William would make such horrible suggestions about people she loved and trusted. Catherine defended Eleanor passionately, describing her sister's devotion and protection, Margaret's maternal love, and the family's history of tragic accidents that William was misinterpreting through his suspicious legal mind. But William's evidence was too comprehensive and specific to be dismissed entirely, and Catherine's initial denials gradually gave way to troubled questions about details she had never considered suspicious before. Why had so many men connected to their family died in accidents? Why had Margaret's behavior become strange in the months before her death? Why had Eleanor's personality changed so dramatically after Margaret's suicide, transforming from a gentle sister into someone who seemed to be watching Catherine's every movement with calculating intensity? Catherine's dawning understanding that William might be telling the truth was visible in her changing expressions, and Eleanor realized that her sister was experiencing the same shattering of reality that Eleanor had felt when discovering Margaret and Charles's conspiracy. The innocence that Eleanor had been trying to preserve by planning Catherine's death was being destroyed anyway through William's revelations, making Catherine's murder both necessary and pointless. Simultaneously, Eleanor's response to overhearing this conversation was swift and decisive. She abandoned her original plan for the engagement party murder and decided to eliminate both William and Catherine that very night, using a more direct method that would frame their deaths as a break-in by unknown assailants rather than murder-suicide. The change in tactics required immediate action before Catherine could process William's information enough to take protective measures or contact authorities. Eleanor had perhaps 6 hours before Catherine's new awareness of danger made her too cautious to be easily killed, and William's evidence meant that any delay would increase the risk of exposure exponentially. The final game was about to begin, with Eleanor moving to eliminate the last 2 people who threatened her absolute control over the Aldridge family legacy. Eleanor's execution of the final murders revealed the full extent of her evolution from victim to predator, demonstrating tactical skills that surpassed anything Margaret had achieved during her criminal career. She waited until the household had settled into sleep before making her move, using her intimate knowledge of Ravenscroft Manor's layout and staff routines to approach William and Catherine without alerting anyone to her presence. Eleanor had prepared a fast-acting poison derived from cyanide compounds, a substance that would kill within minutes, while creating symptoms that could be attributed to heart failure brought on by extreme shock or fear. Her plan was to force both victims to consume the poison at gunpoint, then arrange their bodies and the scene to suggest they had been murdered by intruders who had fled when discovered. The psychological preparation required for Eleanor to murder her own sister face-to-face, looking into Catherine's eyes while forcing her to drink poison, represented a level of emotional detachment that placed Eleanor firmly in the category of true psychopaths. She felt no more hesitation about to killing Catherine than she would about destroying a broken piece of furniture that had become inconvenient. Catherine was no longer her beloved sister. She was a security threat that had to be neutralized before it could cause damage to Eleanor's carefully constructed world. When Eleanor entered Catherine's bedroom that night, she found both Catherine and William awake, discussing William's evidence and trying to decide whether to confront Eleanor directly or flee Newport immediately. Their awareness of danger should have made them more difficult targets, but Eleanor's planning had anticipated this possibility. She appeared in their doorway holding Edmund's old service revolver, her presence so unexpected and her weapon so immediately threatening that neither William nor Catherine had time to react defensively. "I'm sorry you found out," Eleanor told them with genuine regret in her voice. "I had hoped to spare you both the pain of understanding what our family really is. But since you know the truth now, you understand why I can't let you leave this room alive." The conversation that followed was Eleanor's final lesson in the art of psychological dominance, as she explained to Catherine and William exactly how and why they were going to die while maintaining the tone of someone discussing practical arrangements rather than committing double murder. Eleanor's calmness in the face of their terror, her rational explanations for irrational actions, her genuine sorrow at having to kill people she cared about. These contradictions created a psychological atmosphere more terrifying than rage or obvious madness would have been. William and Catherine were facing something beyond their comprehension, a person who could love them and murder them simultaneously. Someone who had become so fundamentally disconnected from normal human emotion that she could commit the ultimate betrayal while genuinely believing she was acting in their best interests. Catherine's final words to Eleanor revealed that she understood something about her sister's transformation that Eleanor hadn't recognized in herself. As Eleanor forced the poisoned wine to Catherine's lips, Catherine looked into her sister's steel-grey eyes, the same eyes that had once watched Margaret plan murders with cold calculation, and whispered, "You're not protecting the family, Eleanor. You've become exactly what destroyed it." The psychological impact of this observation on Eleanor was immediate and devastating, because Catherine had identified the fundamental contradiction in Eleanor's self-justification. Eleanor believed she was preserving the Aldridge family's honor and security, but she had systematically murdered every member of that family until only she remained. She wasn't the family's protector. She was its destroyer, eliminating the very people she claimed to be saving until nothing remained but wealth and reputation built on a foundation of corpses. But Eleanor's moment of self-awareness lasted only seconds before being overwhelmed by the practical necessities of completing the murders and arranging the crime scene. She watched Catherine and William die with the same clinical detachment Margaret had shown during her own killings, noting their symptoms and timing their final moments with scientific precision. Their deaths were quicker than Eleanor had expected, confirming that her poison calculations had been accurate and her methods were sound. Eleanor's arrangement of the crime scene demonstrated expertise that would have impressed professional criminals. She created evidence of forced entry, scattered valuables to suggest robbery as a motive, and positioned the bodies to support her story of discovering the murders when she heard sounds of struggle from Catherine's room. Her performance for the servants and authorities who responded to her screams was flawless, the perfect combination of shock, grief, and terror that convinced everyone of her innocence while establishing her as the primary victim of this terrible tragedy. The investigation into William and Catherine's murders was exactly as perfunctory as Eleanor had predicted. Newport's authorities found no evidence connecting Eleanor to the crimes, no motive for her to harm people she obviously loved, and no reason to suspect that a grieving young woman who had already suffered so much loss could be responsible for additional violence against her own family. Eleanor's reputation as a devoted sister and her obvious devastation at Catherine's death made her the object of community sympathy rather than suspicion. Within a month, the case was officially closed as an unsolved double homicide committed by unknown assailants who had fled the area. Eleanor had achieved the impossible. She had committed the perfect murders, eliminated every threat to her security, and emerged from the investigation with enhanced, rather than diminished social standing. She was now the sole heir to the Aldridge fortune, the tragic survivor of unprecedented family losses and the object of Newport society's protective admiration and support. 6 months after Catherine and William's murders, Eleanor Aldridge had become something unprecedented in Newport society, a wealthy young woman with complete independence, substantial financial resources, and no family obligations or oversight to constrain her choices. She had successfully eliminated every person who might have challenged her decisions, questioned her actions, or threatened her security, creating a perfect bubble of isolation that protected her from external interference while providing unlimited opportunity for future criminal activity. Eleanor's psychological state following the completion of her murder campaign revealed the ultimate destination of Margaret's teachings about power and control. She felt no guilt about the death she had caused, no grief for the family members she had eliminated, no regret about the innocence she had sacrificed to achieve security. Instead, she experienced a profound sense of accomplishment and satisfaction at having solved complex problems through optimal resource management. She had protected herself, preserved the family fortune, maintained social respectability, and eliminated threats with surgical precision. Eleanor's success as a murderer created psychological rewards that were becoming addictive in their intensity. The knowledge that she could end any threat simply by deciding to do so gave her a sense of invulnerability and superiority that transformed every social interaction into a demonstration of her hidden power. She could sit in church services, listening to sermons about morality, while knowing she had committed sins that would horrify the congregation. She could accept sympathy from friends, while secretly feeling contempt for their weakness and naivety. She could make charitable donations and attend social events while carrying the secret knowledge that she was fundamentally different from everyone around her. A predator moving freely among prey who had no idea how dangerous she really was. But Eleanor's isolation also created new psychological pressures that Margaret had never experienced during her own criminal career. Margaret had always operated within the context of family relationships that provided emotional connection and social purpose, even when those relationships were corrupted by manipulation and murder. Eleanor had eliminated all such connections, leaving herself completely alone with her crimes and her secrets. The psychological burden of carrying that knowledge without being able to share it with anyone was beginning to create stress that threatened her mental stability. Eleanor began keeping detailed journals, documenting her thoughts and feelings about the murders she had committed, not from guilt or remorse, but from a need to process the psychological complexity of her experiences with someone who could understand and appreciate her achievements. The journals became Eleanor's confessor and confidant, the only witness to her true nature who could never betray her secrets or judge her actions. Writing about her murders gave Eleanor the psychological relief of acknowledgement while maintaining the security of secrecy, creating a permanent record of her criminal evolution that would eventually become crucial evidence in understanding what the Aldridge family had really been. Eleanor's journals, discovered in 1924 during renovation work at Ravenscroft Manor, provided investigators with insights into the psychology of serial murder that were decades ahead of their time. Her entries revealed not just the practical details of how the murders were committed, but the emotional and intellectual processes that had transformed a gentle young woman into something indistinguishable from her mother's psychopathic nature. The journals documented Eleanor's systematic study of murder methods, her observations about victim psychology, her refinements of techniques based on lessons learned from each killing. She had approached murder as both an art and a science, seeking to perfect her methods while exploring the philosophical implications of holding absolute power over other human lives. Eleanor's writing revealed that she viewed her crimes not as moral failures, but as evidence of evolutionary superiority, proof that she had transcended the emotional limitations that prevented ordinary people from achieving optimal solutions to complex problems. But the journals also revealed something that would have surprised contemporary observers: Eleanor's growing boredom with her secure, isolated existence in Newport. Having eliminated every challenge to her authority and threat to her security, she had created a life so perfectly controlled that it offered no stimulation or excitement. The psychological rewards of successful murder had been so intense that normal social pleasures seemed bland and meaningless by comparison, leaving Eleanor craving new challenges that would provide the same sense of power and accomplishment. Eleanor's solution to this psychological need was ambitious beyond anything Margaret had ever contemplated. She began planning to expand her operations beyond Newport, using her wealth and social connections to establish herself in Boston society, where she could identify new targets and test her skills against more sophisticated opposition. Her goal wasn't mere murder for profit or security. It was the systematic elimination of people she deemed inferior or threatening to social order, a campaign of selective breeding through strategic killing that would improve society by removing its weakest elements. Eleanor's vision of herself as an agent of social evolution, removing genetic and moral defectives through carefully planned deaths, represented the ultimate corruption of everything she had once believed about human dignity and moral obligation. She had become something beyond a simple serial killer. She was a person who genuinely believed that murder was a form of public service, that her victims deserved to die because they were fundamentally inferior to her in intelligence, strength, or moral clarity. Eleanor's expansion into Boston society was methodical and successful, establishing her as a wealthy widow from an old Newport family who was seeking new social connections after tragic losses. Her beauty, intelligence, and substantial fortune made her a welcome addition to Boston's elite circles, where she quickly identified potential victims among men whose deaths would benefit her financially while serving her broader goal of improving society through selective elimination. Eleanor's Boston campaign lasted 3 years, and resulted in the deaths of 5 prominent men whose murders were so perfectly executed that none were ever identified as crimes. Her methods had evolved far beyond Margaret's crude poisonings, incorporating sophisticated techniques that left no physical evidence while creating deaths that appeared to result from natural causes, accidents, or self-inflicted harm. Eleanor's first Boston victim was a wealthy banker whose insider trading activities had enriched him at the expense of small investors. Eleanor courted him for months, gaining his trust and affection while documenting his illegal activities and identifying the optimal method for his elimination. She killed him using a technique she had perfected through experimentation, a nearly undetectable toxin administered through skin contact that caused delayed heart failure, allowing Eleanor to be miles away when the victim collapsed and died. The banker's death was attributed to natural cardiac arrest, brought on by business stress, and Eleanor inherited a substantial bequest he had made after she convinced him that she was planning to marry him. Her second victim was a judge whose corrupt decisions had enabled wealthy criminals to escape justice, while innocent poor defendants received harsh sentences. Eleanor eliminated him using a method that appeared to be suicide, arranging circumstances that made it seem he had taken his own life from guilt over his judicial misconduct. The judge's apparent suicide was accepted without investigation, and Eleanor felt the satisfaction of having delivered justice that the legal system had failed to provide. Eleanor's third, fourth, and fifth victims were eliminated using increasingly sophisticated methods that demonstrated her complete mastery of the art of undetectable murder. Each death served both practical and ideological purposes, enriching Eleanor while removing people she viewed as harmful to society's well-being. Her victims included a factory owner whose unsafe working conditions had killed dozens of employees, a politician whose corrupt practices had enriched criminals at public expense, and a physician whose incompetence had caused patient deaths that were covered up through bribery and influence. Eleanor's psychological state during this period revealed the complete absence of normal human conscience that Margaret had achieved in her own criminal evolution. She felt no guilt about her murders, only pride in her technical expertise and satisfaction at serving what she viewed as the greater good through selective elimination of social parasites. Her journal entries from this period read like the reports of a dedicated public servant documenting successful completion of important civic duties. But Eleanor's expansion of her criminal activities had created exactly the kind of pattern recognition problem that had threatened Margaret's security. 5 prominent men dying of apparent natural causes or accidents within 3 years, all connected to a wealthy young woman from Newport, was beginning to attract attention from investigators who specialized in detecting sophisticated murder schemes. Eleanor's downfall began when Detective James Sullivan of the Boston Police Department noticed statistical anomalies in the deaths of prominent men over the previous 3 years. Sullivan was one of the first investigators in American law enforcement to study crime patterns systematically, looking for connections that might reveal sophisticated criminal operations that escaped detection through traditional investigative methods. His analysis revealed that 5 men had died under circumstances that appeared natural or accidental, but all had been connected to Eleanor Aldridge through romantic relationships, business dealings, or social interactions that positioned her to benefit substantially from their deaths. Sullivan's investigation into Eleanor's background uncovered the suspicious history of deaths surrounding the Aldridge family in Newport, creating a pattern that stretched back over 2 decades and involved more than 15 deaths that had been attributed to accidents, natural causes, or suicide. The statistical probability of so many convenient deaths occurring around 2 generations of the same family was so remote that Sullivan concluded he was looking at the work of multiple killers who had been operating with extraordinary skill and planning. Sullivan's breakthrough came when he gained access to Eleanor's Boston residence through a search warrant based on his statistical evidence. Hidden in Eleanor's private study, he discovered not only her own journals documenting the Boston murders, but Margaret's original journals that Eleanor had preserved as both instruction manuals and trophies of her mother's criminal achievements. The combined evidence revealed the complete scope of the Aldridge family's murder campaign. More than 20 deaths over 25 years, involving multiple killers who had refined and perfected techniques for undetectable murder while accumulating wealth that made them among the richest families in New England. Eleanor's arrest created a sensation that dominated newspaper coverage across the eastern United States. The revelation that a respected Newport family had been operating as serial killers for decades, using their social position and wealth to commit perfect murders while being celebrated by society as tragic victims of circumstance, challenged everything the public believed about the nature of evil and the reliability of social institutions. Eleanor's trial provided the first detailed look into the psychology of a female serial killer, revealing methods and motivations that horrified even experienced law enforcement officials. Her calm testimony about planning and executing murders, her rational explanations for selecting victims, her complete absence of remorse or guilt. These characteristics created a portrait of criminality that seemed to come from a different species, rather than a different moral framework. The evidence against Eleanor was overwhelming and undeniable, including her own detailed confessions written in journals that documented every aspect of her criminal career. Her conviction was certain, but the psychological impact of her revelations would influence criminal investigation methods and public understanding of human evil for generations to come. Eleanor Aldridge was executed on November 15, 1867, becoming the first woman in Massachusetts history to be executed for serial murder. Her final statement, delivered with the same calm composure she had shown throughout her trial, revealed that even facing death, she felt no remorse for her crimes and no regret for the lives she had destroyed. She viewed her execution not as justice, but as society's failure to appreciate the value of the service she had provided through selective elimination of inferior individuals. Eleanor's last words were addressed not to the families of her victims or to God, but to future generations who might someday understand and appreciate what she had accomplished. I have shown that it is possible to improve society through intelligent application of selective pressure. Those who condemn me today do so from ignorance of the greater good I have served. History will vindicate my methods when humanity evolves enough to understand the necessity of what I have done. The execution of Eleanor Aldridge ended the Aldridge family line and brought the murder campaign to a definitive close, but it also created a legacy that would influence criminal behavior for decades to come. Eleanor's journals, preserved as evidence and eventually studied by early criminologists, provided detailed instructions for committing undetectable murders that were far more sophisticated than anything law enforcement had previously encountered. The techniques documented in Eleanor's writings became the foundation for what would eventually be recognized as organized serial killing, influencing criminal methods while simultaneously improving investigative techniques designed to detect and prevent such crimes. The psychological profiles developed from studying Eleanor's mental processes helped establish early criminal psychology as a legitimate field of study, providing insights into the development and identification of psychopathic personalities that remain relevant to modern law enforcement. But Eleanor's most significant legacy was her demonstration that evil could operate successfully within respectable society for extended periods, using wealth, social position, and apparent respectability as camouflage for criminal activity that surpassed anything associated with traditional criminal classes. The Aldridge case forced law enforcement and society to recognize that the most dangerous criminals might be found among the most trusted and respected members of their communities rather than among obvious social outcasts. The Newport mansion where the murders occurred was eventually demolished in 1890, but the psychological impact of what happened within those walls continues to influence how we understand the nature of family loyalty, the corrupting effects of absolute power, and the human capacity for evil disguised as virtue. The Aldridge family's murder campaign remains one of the most sophisticated and successful serial killing operations in American criminal history, a testament to what can be accomplished when intelligence, resources, and complete moral flexibility are combined in service of purely selfish goals. The documents discovered in 1924 revealed one final secret that the authorities considered too dangerous to release publicly. Eleanor's journals contained detailed instructions for training future generations of killers, complete psychological profiles for identifying suitable recruits, and strategic plans for establishing murder operations that could continue indefinitely without detection. Eleanor hadn't viewed her execution as an ending, but as a temporary setback in a multi-generational campaign to improve society through systematic elimination of inferior individuals. Her writings revealed that she had been corresponding with like-minded individuals in other cities, sharing techniques and coordinating activities that could have created a nationwide network of sophisticated killers operating under the cover of respectability and social service. The authorities' decision to suppress these aspects of Eleanor's legacy was based on their recognition that her methods were so effective and her psychological insights so penetrating that releasing them publicly could inspire copycat crimes by people with similar mindsets and resources. Eleanor had created not just a successful murder operation, but a comprehensive manual for establishing and maintaining such operations that was decades ahead of anything law enforcement was prepared to counter. Today, more than 150 years after Eleanor's execution, her influence can still be detected in criminal cases involving sophisticated killers who operate within respectable society while using wealth and social position to avoid detection. The techniques she pioneered, statistical analysis for victim selection, multiple method variation to prevent pattern recognition, psychological manipulation for controlling witnesses and investigators, remain among the most effective approaches for committing undetectable murders. The lesson of the Aldridge family isn't just about the capacity for evil that exists within ordinary-seeming people, but about the systematic nature of that evil when it's combined with intelligence, resources, and the absolute conviction that other people exist only to serve your interests. Eleanor and Margaret Aldridge weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were logical extensions of a worldview that places personal benefit above all moral considerations, carried to its ultimate conclusion through the complete elimination of conscience and empathy. Their story serves as a warning about what humans become when they abandon the emotional connections that make civilization possible, when they view other people as obstacles to be removed rather than fellow beings deserving of life and dignity. In a world where wealth and power continue to provide camouflage for criminal activity, where social respectability can mask the most heinous crimes, where family loyalty can be corrupted into conspiracy for murder, the Aldridge legacy reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized, most trustworthy, most deserving of our respect and admiration. The greatest evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs of malevolence. It smiles at us across dinner tables, helps us plan our futures, and promises to protect us while calculating exactly how and when we'll die. Eleanor Aldridge proved that with enough intelligence, patience, and moral flexibility, it's possible to commit perfect murders for decades while being celebrated as a pillar of society. Her story ends with her execution, but the method she perfected and the insights she documented continue to influence both criminal behavior and law enforcement responses to this day. Some knowledge, once released into the world, can never be completely contained or controlled, and the Aldridge family's contribution to the science of murder remains one of the most dangerous legacies ever left by American criminals.